This is All India Radio. Now we bring you a special program on economic survey and its analysis with senior government officials, chambers of commerce and eminent economic experts.
Today, the Economic Survey 2022 was tabled by the Finance Minister on the first day of the budget session in the Parliament. Tomorrow, she will be presenting the budget for 2022-23. The Economic Survey pegged the GDP growth for the current financial year 2021-22 at 9.2% and projected GDP growth for 2022-23 at 8 to 8.5%. It cited several indicators of macroeconomic stability and strength, which show economy is well poised on a path of sustained long-term recovery. Capital expenditure growing by 13.5%, foreign exchange reserves surpassing $630 billion, massive growth in revenue receipts exceeding expectations, strong rebound in merchandise exports and imports, exponential rise in government spending on infrastructure including roads and railways, buoyant growth in agriculture, manufacturing and services sector, increase in social sector expenditure as proportion of GDP, acceleration of bank credit, reduction in NPAs of banks, moderation in consumer price inflation due to effective supply-side management and cut in excise duty and VAT on fuel, growing adoption of digital technology and improvement in employment indicators are some of the achievements highlighted in the economic survey. Achievements that show the resilience of Indian economy to fight its way through the tough pandemic era and emerge stronger than ever before. Addressing media in New Delhi on the Economic Survey 2021-22, Chief Economic Advisor Dr. Ananta Nageshwaran said that the overall theme of the Economic Survey is based on the theme of the policy pursued by the government, especially in the COVID years. He said the government has adopted a four-pronged approach and it has provided short-term support to the economy, especially to the vulnerable sections during these uncertain times.
There's been a revival of economic activity to pre-pandemic levels in the year 21-22. This shows through in the national accounts and it shows through in a whole bunch of high-frequency data that we have. I've just, for illustration, put the e-way bill collection and you can see that there was a big contraction during the national lockdown last year, then a sharp revival, a more shallow slowdown during the second wave. So even though there was the health cost of the second wave was much more severe, the economic cost of it by almost all accounts was much milder, but there was an impact and then a subsequent revival.
Now we have with us Dr. Bibek Debroy, Chairman of Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. Sir, in the Economic Survey 2022 tabled in the Parliament today, FY22 GDP growth is seen at 9.2%. And for the next year, they have forecasted between 8 to 8.5%. How do you see these projections and how far do you feel the economy is poised to meet these targets?
Let me take them in two parts. Let me take that 9.2%. People outside the government have also remarked on the fact that there is a revival going on. It's a fairly robust revival across sectors, and this does not merely offset the decline that happened in the preceding year. The level of GDP also surpasses the pre-pandemic levels. This is a point that survey has also made. If you look at external forecasts, most people today would go along with that 9.2% real growth rate projected in survey for this financial year. So therefore, I think that 9.2% is completely realistic. Whether it's going to be 9% or 9.5%, we will know only at the end of the year, but 9.2% is completely realistic. The second part of the question was about next financial year, 2022-2023. One must remember that there are certain sectors, contact-intensive sectors, service sectors, which have not yet completely recovered. They are in the process of recovering, and therefore there is a low base, and growth rates are always a function of the low base. Therefore, I would go along with that 8 to 8.5% despite the uncertainty, although I would say that it is perfectly possible that it might actually be a little bit higher.
And sir, talking of services sector, despite the fact that COVID had its maximum impact on the services sector, it has contributed over 50% to India's GDP according to the economic survey, and 8.2% annual growth rate has been forecast. So you feel that this is a very strong indication of sustained recovery in the economy?
Yes, but one should not look only at the share, because remember, services are a very, very heterogeneous basket. There are all kinds of services. And so far as service sector growth is concerned, it is not per se the pandemic, it is the restrictions on economic activity that followed the pandemic. Some service sectors, travel-related, trade, hotels, restaurants, tourism, some of those are still affected by restrictions. Anything that has human-to-human contact is still affected. And that's the reason I said that in next year, these will recover, and I find 8 to 8.5% perfectly realistic. What is important is already one can see revival of construction. And therefore, yes, I do think the services sector will grow pretty fast.
And so the industry sector, the gross value added or the growth rate is 11.8% projection, and agriculture is 3.9%. What is your estimation of the major budget announcements which will support this growth?
What is implicitly said in the survey, implicitly, not explicitly, is that what one will expect in the budget is a continuation of the policies. The survey says it implicitly, not explicitly, that the reason India has recovered fairly fast and fairly well from the effects of the pandemic is because of these successful policies. So I do not think, one should not look at only the union budget, because the budget is only one day in the year, and government does not cease to function on other days of the year, although the budget is important because it is a major event where government announces what its thinking is. So what I expect in the budget is a continuation of the government's policies since actually May 2014, because in some sense this government is a continuation of the past government. And that is essentially what survey also says, that have an enabling framework for growth, have an enabling framework for consumption, investments, private investments, exports, do not throw fiscal consolidation to the winds, and simultaneously have a social safety net.
Sir, retail inflation remains moderate during current year. It has been projected at 5.2% in 2021-22. In fact, that is the figure for April to December. But at the same time, Economic Survey has cautioned about imported inflation. So how do you see the inflation situation being tackled on the fiscal level and the monetary level?
But inflation is still within the band set by the Reserve Bank's MPC. So I would not be unnecessarily concerned about inflation. The nature of this inflation, and survey also points it out, is sometimes dislocations that have happened for various reasons. And this kind of inflation is not always amenable to monetary policy instruments. There are certain kinds of inflation that are amenable to monetary policy instruments, but this kind of inflation is not amenable to that. So far as imported inflation is concerned, yes, commodity prices have been going up. Imported inflation is also a function of what happens to the exchange rate. So if the rupee tends to depreciate, imported inflation tends to be more. I should, however, also say that the Indian economy is no longer as amenable to crude price increase shocks as it used to be in the past.
And sir, the startup ecosystem, if we look at that, the boom that has come there from 500 in 2014, now we have more than 60,000 startups. And the thrust that the government is giving to the micro, small and medium enterprises, you feel this will be also another key to economic recovery, and this thrust will be continued?
Yes, absolutely, because in the course of the pandemic, at a very broad-based level of generalization, the MSME sector has suffered a lot. And I think the MSME sector will begin to recover in the coming financial year. Although one must also be a little bit careful about what we mean by MSME, because a large number of MSME enterprises are not registered under any legal form, and therefore perforce they resort to informal credit markets. One of the things that's going to be on the agenda, I'm not saying it's going to happen tomorrow, but at some point we must evolve a form of legal identity for MSME enterprises, most of whom are not registered under any law.
And sir, Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan, production-linked incentive scheme to boost manufacturing in specific sectors, all this has happened in the pandemic times. Do you feel this targeted reforms approach of the government in productive sectors has turned the COVID crisis into an opportunity?
Yes, it has in terms of ensuring that manufacturing, you used the word industry earlier, manufacturing is narrower than industry. Manufacturing in some sectors already, one can see that India is becoming a part of the global supply chain, and investments that might have happened in other countries have now begun to come to India. So therefore, I would say that this is a very, very good sign, because the multiplier benefits from any investments that happen in India are much higher compared to plain and simple imports happening from other countries.
And so lastly, the strategy of the government so far has largely been teach people fishing instead of giving them fish. We saw that though the government did give a direct benefit support through Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana and other schemes for the marginalized and vulnerable, the major thrust so far has been on enabling the spirit of entrepreneurship, where people become job creators instead of job seekers. How far has this approach of empowering and enabling yielded productive results?
I agree with what you have said, and the PM has said it himself in more than one speech. But I would not quite state it in either or terms, because the government's position has been fairly clear that yes, you move away from entitlement, begin to empower people, provide them with the physical infrastructure, social infrastructure, other kinds of inputs that are essential to enhance their productivity, unleash entrepreneurship, reduce poverty, generate employment, but simultaneously there will be targeted beneficiaries who will need some kind of subsidization. So that's also simultaneously been happening. While what you have said is absolutely correct, I would not exactly posit it as an either or, because both have to happen simultaneously.
Thank you so much, sir, for your time.
Thank you.
We would like to welcome Mr. Subrakant Panda, Senior Vice President of FICCI. Sir, the Economic Survey 2021-22 released today has projected 9.2% growth in GDP in the year 2021-22. In order to maintain this momentum of growth, what do you feel will be the fiscal stance that will be required? The budget is coming up tomorrow. What are your expectations from the budget?
Well, first of all, as far as the fiscal stance is concerned, the fiscal deficit for FY22, I believe, was projected at about 6.8%, and I believe it might be a little less than that on account of buoyant tax and non-tax revenue growth. In as much as expectations from the budget is concerned, I would look at in three buckets. One is relief, which is to provide relief to those at the bottom of the pyramid. So a higher outlay for Manrega, for example, to support the rural poor. And not only that, projects taken up through Manrega, for example, will also help in generating employment. We also expect support for the urban poor through a Manrega-like scheme. And as far as industry is concerned, I think it is imperative to provide support to MSMEs, which are the employment generation machine of the economy and have certainly been affected quite noticeably during the pandemic. In the recovery bucket, I would like to classify measures to spur consumption as being very critical. So putting money in the hands of average person, whether it is through an increase in tax slabs or whether it is through direct benefit transfer, etc., that will spur consumption, leading to demand, and that will then in turn bring in investment, which is, as you know, the start of the virtuous cycle. And finally, in the reform bucket, we expect to see not only measures continuing in terms of the ease of doing business oriented stance, which has served the country very well, but also some focus on reducing the cost of doing business, and besides that, perhaps focus on expanding the PLI schemes to more sectors, and finally focus on areas like green technology and R&D and innovation, which is what will modernize the economy and propel the next round of growth.
In the economic survey on demand side, consumption is estimated to grow by 7%, gross fixed capital formation by 15%, exports by 16.5%, and imports by 29.4% in 2021-22. Do you feel the year ahead is poised for a pickup in private sector investment, with the financial system in good position to provide support for economy's revival?
Absolutely. I think it is time that the private sector capex comes into play. Clearly, during the ongoing year FY22, it is government expenditure which has sort of sustained the economy, and in as much as private capital expenditure is concerned, that is yet to kick in, and it is high time that it does so. And as you mentioned, the fact that the foreign exchange reserves are at all-time highs, the fact that vaccination levels have reached quite a high level in terms of 75% of the adult population being fully vaccinated, and exports finally sort of breaking out of a longish period of plateauing to now hopefully touch the $400 billion mark during the current fiscal. So these three factors taken together, I think, is what will provide us the sort of wherewithal to face up to any unexpected challenges in FY23. Also, I reiterate the importance of private sector investment coming into play, which I think the conditions are now right for that to happen.
Agriculture was one sector which showed buoyancy even in 2020 when the pandemic caused a recession in the country. Manufacturing and services were, of course, hit badly, especially services. Now we have seen a revival in these two sectors as well. How do you see the resilience of the Indian economy now to the pandemic, surfacing from time and again? Because till now also COVID's end is not in sight. So how do you see the industry coping with this situation?
Let me respond by saying that, look, the end of COVID may not really be in sight, but we're certainly, I think, thanks to the high levels of vaccination, that in itself will have a mitigating impact of COVID on the economy and people in general. And hopefully we will transition from COVID being a pandemic to being an endemic, something that we have to learn to live with, but something which will not be as disruptive as it has been in the last couple of years. But that apart, I think clearly the Indian economy has shown itself to be resilient. I mean, certain parts of it you couldn't help but measures required early on to contain the spread of COVID when we knew very little about it, when there was no vaccines, etc. available, and mobility restrictions, etc. was the only way to prevent it from going out of control. So those sort of measures which were necessary but which have obviously been disruptive. But despite that, it is heartening that the agriculture sector has stood out both during the peak period of the pandemic as well as the forecast for FY23. Clearly, manufacturing or industry in general, the industrial sector is expected to perform well, and in that context, steps taken such as the PLI scheme to sort of provide a boost to the manufacturing sector in India are very welcome and will have a good impact. And services, which has been affected the most by the pandemic, hopefully will now make up for the lost time. I would reiterate that the Indian economy is resilient. It has benefited from some deft handling, and while a lot of countries look to throw the kitchen sink at the problem with fiscal measures, which later on proved to be inflationary, but the more measured approach adopted in India seems to have been the right thing to do, which is what we are seeing in the numbers today.
Thank you so much, sir, for this interview.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Now we'll be talking to Mr. Ranjit Mehta, economic policy expert. The key highlight of economic survey was 9.2% growth is expected in 2021-22. How do you see these projections, and how do you feel the government can support industry and the other sectors of the economy in achieving this growth rate?
This was really good news that the economy had grown around 9.2%, which is more than the pre-COVID level. Now, it has been, hampered by the supply side problems. Because of that, the inflation had really gone up during COVID times. But now, I think that the good thing, what we can see is the government has a very good revenue collection in terms of taxes. So it seems that government has a good fiscal space right now. So here is the opportunity for capital expenditure, and here's the opportunity to spend in the infrastructure space. So this will actually give money in the hands of people, and we also need to generate employment. I think that the way we have the target for achieving $5 trillion economy by 2025, this is an opportunity where government can really push the infrastructure expenditure without worrying for the fiscal deficit.
You're talking about the thrust on capital expenditure. In fact, the theme of last year's budget was also the same. Infrastructure growth, be it the digital infrastructure, physical infrastructure, or the health infrastructure. And we have seen that railways, roads have seen a massive increase in their expenditure. Do you feel that a multiplier effect will be a major booster to the economy as a result of this? And will this pull in private investment also?
Yes, definitely. The railways have come out with a very ambitious plan, and Indian Railway has envisioned to be fully electrified by 2023-24, which is very good. And the kind of investment that the government has done in railway sector, and that too, there is opportunity for the private sector in station modernization plans. But right now, the worry is that, private capex is not coming. Therefore, it is the government which has to pump in money into infrastructure. But in this economic survey, we have seen one more bright spot, that agriculture has really contributed significantly this year. This is a very good thing, because despite the COVID, despite all these problems, we have not seen such a contribution from rural economy, from agriculture especially, more than around 16.3% during this year. This is really wonderful.
In fact, as you very rightly pointed out, that agriculture has stood strong during the pandemic, even during 2020. Manufacturing and services especially took a hit, and we saw the recession in 2020, which we have very strongly rebounded in 2021-22. What kind of measures is the industry expecting so that this growth momentum is maintained, especially for the micro, small and medium enterprises?
Yes, MSMEs have basic three problems they have. Number one, they have a problem of finance. That means a reasonable rate of finance. Number two, they have problem of access to market. And third is access to technology. These are the three basic problems of Indian MSME. So, problem of finance, to a great extent, government has come out with number of programs, and they have pumped in a lot of money during this COVID for the MSME sector. And in terms of access to the market, we have this government e-portal where MSMEs can register. But the problem in India is we have around 70 to 80% MSMEs are very, very small entrepreneurs. So all these registration in e-marketplace, it is not happening without the GST registration. So this is where probably government has to look into that, how those people can be incorporated in the e-portal, in the e-commerce market, and what is to be done, because these people probably they cannot afford to have a CA or the kind of formalities there are. Probably this is a pain point. And yes, we have also seen that this manufacturing sector, now it is in pre-COVID levels. So this is a good thing. But only thing is our hospitality sector is still yet to recover from the COVID problem. There probably some kind of stimulus, some kind of attention is needed in this hospitality and airline sector.
Corporate tax rates in India after the cut in 2018 are among the lowest in the world. In the taxation sphere, do you expect any relief? Is there any room for government to give relief?
As you have rightly indicated that we are at par with the international taxation regime, and to an extent that for companies who are starting in recent years, the taxation rate is around 15%. And we are competitive as far as taxation is concerned with the global market. So there we don't have much of a space. But maybe if you talk of this capital market, maybe long-term capital gain can be looked into it.
Thank you so much for this insightful discussion, Mr. Mehta.
Thank you very much.
We have with us Mr. Vikas Mishra, Senior Advisor in Indian Bank Association. Year-on-year bank credit growth accelerated gradually in 2021-22 from 5.3% in April 2021 to 9.2% as on 31st December 2021. What is the significance of this acceleration in credit growth? How important is it for the acceleration of the economy itself?
Pandemic thing had affected to some extent this aspect because there were no takers for some time. But then the government came with this employee credit guarantee scheme, and that was a game changer. In fact, within a short span of time, all the MSME and trading concerns, they could get this benefit, and without much paperwork, they all got additional credit because some of them were at the verge of closure. So this is aspect, and the government to increase the expenditure on the infrastructure side. So after this third phase of pandemic, now it will be business as usual, and agriculture sector for the first time is going to show a growth rate of around 4% or so. So this is also something very substantial, notwithstanding the fact that agriculture doesn't constitute the kind of contribution 20 years back. But even then, so these are the plus factors. Gradually the pandemic going away, so it should be business as usual. Our MSME sector, our manufacturing sector, now things have started showing signs of a lot of improvement.
As per the economic survey, the gross non-performing advances ratio of scheduled commercial banks declined from 11.2% at the end of 2017-18 to 6.9% at the end of September 2021. Net non-performing advances ratio declined from 6% to 2.2% during the same period. At the same time, the bad bank, which was announced in the last budget, that has also been operationalized now. How do you see this situation of bad loans being tackled in the future also?
What has happened in the last, we did have a strong recovery law in the country. And you see the last 5 years with the coming in of IBC, Insolvency Bankruptcy Court, and the setting of NCLT, IBBI. So now we have a strong recovery law in the country, and the recovery, the NPA percentage, gross GNPA, has come down to the level you just now mentioned. It was as high as 11.8% in March 18. So you see these changes, because once you have a recovery law, the people will be much more concerned. The willful defaulters will not be there, and this is what has happened. And for the growth of the economy, we must keep the NPAs within the manageable level, which is now started happening for the first time. And at the same time, during the last financial year, at the end of the March 2021, for the first time, all the public sector banks were in profit. This also happened after 5 years. So these are the positive silver linings in the banking sector. This has happened largely on account of the various reforms that the government undertook.
The average CPI, the Consumer Price Index inflation, moderated to 5.2% in 2021-22 April-December from 6.6% in the corresponding period of 2021. This moderation in interest rates and it's staying in the comfort level of RBI and the thrust that the government is giving to growth, do you feel these factors combined will ensure that RBI keeps up with its accommodative monetary policy? Where do you see the interest rates going in India?
We had this very low rate of interest for a very long period. This was, I think, the best thing that the government could have done. This interest rate, and at the backdrop, we have this guarantee scheme. These two things have contributed towards some kind of restoration of normalcy in the banking sector. Because at the time when there are stress everywhere because of the pandemic, so you need to give something extra to the people to have incentive to carry out business. And this is what has happened. The interest rate has gone a long way in charging the housing loan market, the retail segment, and also the corporate world. Because this is in any case, even notwithstanding the public issues and also the other ways of mobilizing funds in the form of other areas, commercial papers and all, bank credit remains one of the most important sources of the finance for the industry and for the country.
What are your major expectations from the budget for the banking sector?
We had a lot of things last budget. So we only expect that maybe the fixed deposit we have been asking that the lock-in period should be less, because as such our middle class and now the retired class, they all put their money in banks only in the form of deposit. So we are expecting some concessions there so that they continue to park their funds with the banks. And second thing is that our bad bank has almost getting started. And these, the prime institute that were envisaged in the last year budget, one was the NARCL, National Asset Reconstruction Company Limited. Then we have this debt resolution company, and we also have this infrastructure company. These three things were envisaged last year, and also it was envisaged to get two public sector banks leveraged. So this budget can be a continuation of that, and they will be quickly implemented. Now this is more important, and the bad bank thing has already, things have been cleared with all the stakeholders. So other two institutes also start functioning, and something we expect for the depositors also, so that they have some attraction to continue to keep their funds in the bank.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mishra, for this discussion.
Thank you.
All eyes are on the budget for 2022-23 to be presented by the Finance Minister tomorrow. As always, but more so this time because of the pandemic times, there will be a range of expectations from various segments like the industry, agriculture, manufacturing, services, the middle class, the poor and the marginalized. In fact, just about every citizen of the country. Balancing these expectations and maintaining fiscal prudence is what the budget is all about, much beyond just a balance between expenditures and revenues. We look forward to bringing you a detailed analysis of budget announcements tomorrow from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. Do join us. Namaskar.
You were listening to a special program on economic survey and its analysis with senior government officials, chambers of commerce and eminent economic experts. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of All India Radio. You can listen to it on our mobile app, News on AIR. The program is also available on our YouTube channel, News on AIR Official. You may email your opinion about this program at airnsttalks@gmail.com.